welcome to another episode of my podcast, One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. I'm your hostess, Caitlin, with 20 plus years experience within sewing and 12 plus years experience within the hobby of living history. This podcast explores such things as historic wardrobes, myth debunking, stories and experience from living history events that I have attended, and also somewhat of how I have incorporated what I have learned from history into my everyday 21st century life. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, I would love it if you would consider subscribing to follow along. Last time we discussed part 1 of food preservation in the 19th century, starting with animal and animal products. And this time we're going to talk about dressing the late 18th century infant, really infants from birth to about 6 or 8 months or so. So without further ado, let's get started. Now obviously we can't get into all the facets of dressing a late 18th century infant, but we're going to do our best. There are differences for class, ethnicity, where you are in the world, etc. For the podcast's sake, we are going to be looking at American and English clothing, and we're mostly not talking about swaddling because that is somewhat being seen as an older style of dressing infants, although we will somewhat talk about swaddling. We're going to mostly focus on the newfangled way of dressing infants. So let's begin with talking about some changes that are common during the late 18th century in regards to infants' clothing. Domestic Medicine by William Buchanan in 1774 says, quote, "The clothing of an infant is so simple a matter that it is surprising how any person should err in regard to it. Yet many children lose their lives and others are deformed by inattention to this article. On the clothing of children, nature knows no other uses for clothing for an infant but to keep it warm. All that is necessary for this purpose is to wrap it in a soft, loose covering. Were a mother left to the dictates of nature alone, she would certainly follow this method," end quote. Now this quote and most of the others I have found are contrary to what most folks, including myself, think of when we think of 18th century infant clothing. We are always told, and most think today, that the infants were still swaddled with strips of linen, much like somewhat of a little mummy, but alive and unable to move. And while this was certainly still practiced in some areas, it was more common to dress children loosely by the second half of the 18th century, with the idea of loose clothing for infants gaining considerable popularity, where it is nearly universal. A few paragraphs later from the quote I read above, Mr. Buchanan writes, quote, "In several parts of Britain, the practice of rolling children with so many bandages is now in some measure laid aside, but it would still be a difficult task to persuade the generality of women that the shape of a child does not entirely depend on the care of the midwife. So far, however, in their endeavors to mend the shape of children from being successful, that they have constantly operated the contrary way, and mankind became deformed just in proportion to the means used to prevent it. How little deformity of body is to be found among uncivilized nations. So little indeed that it's vulgarly believed that they put all their deformed children to death. The truth is, they hardly know such a thing as a deformed child. Neither should we, if we followed their example. Savage nations almost never think of manacling their children. They allow them the full use of every organ, carry them abroad in open air, wash their bodies daily in cold water, etc. By this management, their children become so strong and hardy that by the time our puny infants get out of the nurse's arms, they are able to shift for themselves. They cannot indeed tell their complaints, but they can shew signs of pain, and this they never fail to do so by crying when pinched by their clothes. No sooner are they free from their bracings that they seem pleased and happy. Yet strange infatuation, the moment they hold their peace, they are again committed to the chains. If we confide the body of an infant as a bundle of soft pipes replenished with fluids in continual motion, the danger of pressure will appear in the strongest light. Nature, in order to make the way for the growth of children, has formed their bodies soft and flexible, and lest they should receive any injury from the pressure of the womb, has surrounded the fetus everywhere with fluids. This shews the care which nature takes to prevent all unequal pressure on the bodies of infants, and to defend them against everything that might in the least cramp or confine their motions," end quote. Now, something that really surprised me when I was researching for this podcast was a few pages later, when the same source states, quote, "It would be safer to fix on the clothes of an infant with strings than pins, as these often gall and irritate their tender skins and occasion convulsions. Pins have been found sticking above half an inch into the body of a child after it had died of convulsions, which in all probability proceeded from that cause. We shall only add, with respect to the clothes of children, that they ought to be kept very clean. Cleanliness is not only agreeable to the eye, but tends greatly to preserve the health of children," end quote. Now, if you've seen any of my other content, either as a podcast or on YouTube, you'll know that I have been for some time seeing how early the use of tapes or strings to close an infant's clothing as opposed to pins begins. I believe before this source, the earliest one I had was 1807 or so. So I was actually quite pleased and also a little surprised to know that in 1774, we are already seeing recommendations to leave off the use of pins in infants' clothing. Now, I know not everyone followed this advice because well into the 1850s, we are still seeing doctors and advice writers lament the use of pins in infants' clothing. So obviously it continues in practice. But it is nice to know that not only is it safer in infants' clothing to use tapes and ties, but it's also historically correct to use tapes and ties this early. Now, the source does not state which clothes are to tie, and my source for making 18th century diapers and diapers covers does not mention adding ties, but there is at least a plausible case for not using pins in an 18th century infant's clothing. In fact, I found a few other sources that also warned against the use of pins and advised the use of tapes as well. 1781's An Essay on the Management and Nursing of Children in the Earlier Periods of Infancy says, quote, "The number of pins used in the dress of a child is sometimes very great, but when tapes or strings can be substituted for them, they are much preferable. The foundling dresses, so-called from being first invented at the Foundling Hospital, for the sake, no doubt, of convenience and dispatch, are come much into use. They draw and tie with strings, and are otherwise so contrived that very few pins become needful in putting them on. The advantage which attends a dress so contrived and put on are considerable enough to recommend it. In the first place, the risk of pricking and wounding the tender bodies of children is avoided, which now and then happen notwithstanding the utmost care and caution, where a great many pins are used, and secondly, the dress fits so much easier and pleasanter, and is put on with more dispatch and less fatigue to the child." End quote. This source also talks about swaddling being an old-fashioned manner of dressing children, quote, "In dressing a newborn child, indeed ever afterwards, simplicity and ease should be consulted and observed as much as possible. Great care ought to be taken that no part of the body or limbs be tightly bound, or closely confined by rollers or any part of the dress, as tight rolling and confining the limbs, which was formerly practiced, must be very injurious and must greatly impede and prevent the growth, strength, and activity of the infant." End quote. Now let's describe each article of clothing an infant might wear in the 18th century. Beginning with diapers. Diapers are usually linen in this time period due to its absorbency and the feeling soft and dry against the touch, even when wet. Now, I haven't seen the word diaper used specifically for these articles, but I have seen clout or linen clout, or even sometimes squares of diaper, because they were made of linen diaper cloth. Diaper is a thicker cloth, at least much thicker than a plain weave cloth, and designs are woven into it. The thick nature of diaper cloth makes it ideal for diapers or napkins. Other options for diapers would include things such as plain linen fabric, or if poor, well-washed linen from old sheets or tablecloths that were then cut into squares. I haven't found a good recommendation for how many diapers should be prepared for the 18th century baby, but the closest I have found was a recommendation published in 1789's Instructions for Cutting Out Apparel for the Poor. This source gives the cost per 2 dozen diapers, and it does recommend that 2 dozen be included when doing what is called lending linen to the poor. And it also explains how to make up these diapers. So this is wealthier ladies who are putting together baskets, per se, of infant clothing for women who are on charity and unable to afford clothing for their own infant. So they are suggesting 2 dozen diapers in this basket. This would have been considered the bare minimum. And so most people are going to have for their own children, if they're not relying on charity, more diapers than the 2 dozen. To make up the diaper, quote, "Made a figured diaper called L wide, but measures 1 yard, 1 nail and a quarter only. 10 shillings piece, which contains 7 yards and a quarter. 2 pieces divided into 12 make 24 squares of diaper double, half a yard and near a nail wide, but not quite square." End quote. Translated, the unfinished diapers would be 19 and a quarter inches and by 43 and a half inches. This makes them not quite even when worn, but it allowed for no fabric wastage, which was very important in the 18th century. These squares of diaper were narrow hemmed all around, and that was all that was needed to finish them. The advantage to do them this way is that after they are used for diapers, they are basically the same size and shape as towels and can be used as such, thus extending their use. To use the squares, the rectangles will be folded in half to nearly form an exact square, but again, it won't quite be even. And then the 2 opposite corners were put together to create a triangle. Baby is laid on top of the on top of the triangle with the long bias edge against its back, and the points are wrapped up to be pinned and tied to be pinned in front. Over the diaper could go a square of flannel or a pilch or a pilcher, all period terms dating to the late 18th century. Now this is an optional layer and sometimes only worn for the first few months. In Mr. Underwood's 1784 work, A Treatise on the Diseases of Children, with directions for the management of infants from the birth, quote, I shall take this opportunity of dropping a word against the old fashion still too much in use, which contributes not a little to make children weak, that of wearing a pilch, which, though originally designed only for the first few weeks after birth, is often worn for as many months. It can answer no possible end but that of saving trouble to servants, since instead of keeping children clean and dry, it does directly the contrary. For if it has received any wet through the usual cloth laid over it, it ought itself to be changed as often as the other, or most certainly be damp and uncleanly. Whilst by heating the loins and lower limbs, it has a manifest tendency to relax and dispose infants to become rickety. End quote. The New Royal English Dictionary of 1780 defines a pilch as, quote, a kind of clout or flannel used to keep infants from wetting their beds by urine. End quote. Volume 2 of the New and Complete Dictionary of the English Language from 1775 defines a pilch as, quote, a flannel nightgown, a clout for an infant. End quote. These are again worn over a diaper to keep wet from seeping through the other layers. It is made of flannel, but this is a square of wool flannel. Cotton flannel is not of use in this time period. And the color is usually off-white or buff. Again, these are totally optional. Instructions for cutting apparel out for the poor, again 1780s, describes this article as a square of flannel around 31.5 inches that are folded in half to form a triangle and then pinned on like a diaper. It says, quote, 1 yard and 3/4 of white lace flannel, called yard wide but measures 3/4.5 only, at 11.5 pence per yard, which makes 2 squares. It also says as an asterisk, quote, this being very necessary and useful to the poor women, it is not required to be returned with the childbed linen, end quote. So these are only seen as necessary if you are not going to be diligent in watching baby's toilet cues and actually need the diaper to hold urine to not wet all the other clothes and bedding. For living historians who want to continue to use modern cloth or disposable diapers, these wool flannel covers make excellent period diaper covers for the modern diapers. After a child is toilet trained, or at least the parents are trained to watch and react to the child's potty cues a few months old or so, the diaper would be left off. While 24 diapers is recommended in the 1780s sources to send out to the poor, only 2 squares of flannel are mentioned. Our next garment would be the roller or bandage or belly band. These are strips of linen or flannel, sometimes both are worn at the same time, that are kind of left over from the days of swaddling. They are meant to wrap around baby's torso to protect the umbilical site until it is fully healed. This is a sensitive area and improperly treated could become infected or hemorrhage, which of course could be deadly in the 18th century. Instructions for cutting out apparel for the poor doesn't even mention these, but I can find plenty of other references to this article of clothing. Other sources didn't seem to care for them, such as the Family Magazine or Repository of Religious Instruction from 1788, quote, another thing which is very distressing to a young infant is confining its body with a roller and its head with a long stay. Let any person consider whether it would not be painful for themselves to be dressed in such a manner, how much more so it must be to a tender infant, end quote. Now that was more about a swaddling roller, which is a similar article but not quite as long, but much longer and wraps around, of course, the whole body as opposed to just the torso, like what we're talking about here. 1766, A Treatise on the Theory and Practice of Midwifery, says, quote, the child being washed, a linen rag is wrapped around the tied funis, which being doubled along the belly, a square compress is laid over it and kept firm or moderately tight with what the nurses call a belly band or roller around the body, end quote. 1779, a letter to a lady on the management of an infant says, quote, as to the dress, it should consist of a belly band made of a fine piece of linen cloth, doubled 3 fingers wide. When the navel strings is off, put it on single, and when quite well, omit it entirely, as a shirt with strings answers for the same purpose. A blanket, a short loose roller, a loose gown, and 1 cap are all that is necessary, end quote. So here we see the belly band being a linen piece that is wrapped around baby twice, although once the umbilical cord has fallen off, it wraps around only once, and when that site is fully healed, it is left off entirely. And there's also a short loose roller or a flannel band which goes on what is called a blanket, which we will discuss in a moment. An essay on the management and nursing of children says, quote, a flannel roller 4 to 6 inches broad is commonly rolled once or twice moderately tight about the body upon the navel, and was originally and very properly designed for to support the navel, to prevent a rupture in it, to which is subject at that tender age, from causes both natural and accidental. It is customary in many parts of the kingdom to roll a broad linen or crepe roller very tight over this, as we have just now mentioned, a great many folds thick, all upon the body from the armpits to the hips, supposing the body to stand in need of such support, but which, however, as above observed, does not, and therefore becomes not only unnecessary but hurtful. A broad flannel roller over the shirt, loosely folding the body once or twice, is used by some nurses and is very proper, as it keeps the child more regularly warm than any other form of dress can do, and answers every purpose of support very effectually, besides being easy and comfortable. But care should be taken always to let it be put on loose enough. Those who are accustomed to children will readily know when they are too tightly rolled or confined in their dress, as they discover a particular kind of uneasiness, with the motion of their arms and body seeming to struggle as if they wanted to disengage themselves from encumbrance or oppression, attended to a continued restlessness and fretting. I have seen children in great pain and distress from this cause, and they were instantly relieved and perfectly at ease upon removing or loosening the dress. This caution in dressing is well worth attending to, as any part of the dress, if put on very tight, will prove very painful and distressing to the child, and is what often happens through the lessness and want of care in servants who have the management of the children, who are very subject to commit this error, if they not be now and then looked after, end quote. So here we see a flannel roller next to the skin and then the linen one over top. Other places only mention the flannel one, some only mention the linen roller. So there are definitely options on how you choose to use a roller. Some sources leave them on longer, but the most common suggestion is that they are abandoned as soon as the umbilical site is healed. And now we get to shirts, the first true garment that we would recognize as a piece of clothing today. Shirts should be white and are generally made of soft linen or linen lawn. Shirts for infants typically open all the way down the front, so they are very much adjustable and can be wrapped around the infant if too large at first. No closures are used, instead the shirts are held shut with subsequent layers. Shirts in this time period typically had long sleeves as well. Instructions for cutting out apparel for the poor says 2 1/4 yards of fabric about 30 inches wide will make 6 shirts, which is what is recommended to lend to the poor. These shirts were made as little shifts with a body, separate sleeves, and even little mini tiny gussets, and they're super cute. These styles could have had a bit of what is called Hanover lace at the neck. For wealthier babies, I have also seen infant shirts from the late 18th century with frills of lace not only at the neck, but also at the ends of sleeves, and sometimes as an insertion at the shoulder area. This, however, is not the only way to make infant shirts. A very simple and economical style, often made of linen diaper or a thicker linen fabric, such as a toweling, and usually with a woven design, is merely a rectangle 17 inches by 14 inches. Slits are cut for the shoulders, and the bottom piece is folded in to create the body. The only fabric wastage is where the neckline is cut out. The style is no fuss, simple to put together, without the mess of having sleeves and gussets to deal with. Sharon Bernstein has a diagram and directions for this type of shirt on her website. 1779's A Letter to the Lady on the Management of an Infant is the only reference I have seen to shirts tying with strings or tapes, but all the originals I have seen and all the descriptions of shirts merely have them folded over and held in place by the next couple layers. The 1779's reason for having shirts with strings was to replace the linen roller or bandage, as it serves the same purpose. So one, in theory, could replace that bit of clothing for a tied shirt if desired, and that would be less sewing and fewer layers to keep track of. The next layer a newborn would wear is something called a bed or a blanket. This is quite literally a square of wool flannel about 30 inches square or thereabouts. Instructions for cutting out apparel for the poor has these beds or blankets finished on the edges with a binding of statute galloon. Galloon is a woven or braided ribbon, sometimes with a brocade-like pattern, and is typically found in colors such as gold or silver. I assume these could also be hemmed with a herringbone stitch, as were most flannel apparel, but I have not come across any extant pieces to judge this by. This is a garment both used in swaddling and also the bedgown dressing of an infant. The Ladies' Magazine or Entertainment or Entertaining Companion for the Fair Sex in 1785, explains the swaddling concept of dressing an infant. Quote, as soon as the infant being well cleaned, he is wrapped up in his swaddling clothes. They first put on a shirt, a bit open before, and afterwards gird the breast with a square piece of cloth called a bed, which extends even to the feet, over which they apply a woolen roller, 3 inches broad, in circles which extend, descending towards the inferior extremities, from whence they roll back again to the waist. They also sometimes content themselves with taking some circular turns on the breast, and with keeping the arms stretched by means of pieces of linen or a woolen waistcoat put over the bed. Upon this the child is laid, its arms confined and extended against his body by a fold made to this waistcoat, and the whole kept close by another woolen roller of about 2 ells in length, applied in circles like the former. In short, over all they put a blanket, which is worn for a certain time in all seasons. In many places, the infant thus swathed is laid on a square mattress stuffed with feathers, one in leaf which sustains the head, while the other answers to the feet. The last is doubled up and fastened with 2 lateral corners with large pins. As to the head, it is covered with 2 or 3 small biggins, the first of which is of linen and the others woolen, and tied behind the neck. In many places they add a stay-band, or a kind of headdress, which 2 ends hang down on the side of the head and are fastened to the breast with pins, in order to make the infant hold its head straight, which very well supplies the want of the mattress I just mentioned. End quote. Of course, we've already read the quote from 1779, a letter to a lady on the management of an infant, but to summarize it again, quote, as to the dress, it should consist of a belly band, a blanket, a short roller, a loose gown, 1 cap. End quote. These blankets have no ties or closures. Most often I see them being held shut with that flannel roller or belly band. These garments continue to be used for newborn infants well into the 1820s for day wear, and as a night petticoat well into the 1830s, although by that time buttons and buttonholes have replaced that woolen roller to keep it in place. That does not seem, however, to be an 18th century manner of closing this bed or blanket. Instructions for cutting out apparel for the poor recommends 2 beds be lent to the poor. And now we finally get to the gown, a bedgown to be exact. These are very simple, made similarly to a lady's bedgown of the era. Some were made very simply indeed, with just fronts, backs, and sleeves cut as one piece, and the only sewing needed is to sew down the side seams and hem the whole garment. These gowns can be very long, sometimes a yard in length, and usually opened up all the way in front to be pinned in place. Instructions for cutting out apparel for the poor has a couple of directions for infant bedgowns that are somewhat more difficult and complex design, where the sleeves are sewn in and therefore require some more work to be made, but the overall gown is fancier as well. The extant gowns I have seen were made of linen, and instructions for cutting out apparel for the poor does recommend that these bedgowns be made out of a printed linen. 2 1/4 yards of linen, about 25 inches wide, should make 2 bedgowns according to the instructions for cutting out apparel for the poor, and the same source recommends that 2 bedgowns be included when lending linen to the poor. Most extant sources state that only a single cap ought to be worn by newborn, but instructions for cutting out apparel for the poor does still include undercap directions as well as the regular cap. These undercaps are to be made of fine lawn linen, and 3/4 yard ought to make 6 undercaps, which was the recommended amount to lend to the poor. These consisted of 2 pieces, the headpiece and then the undercap called the caul. The headpiece was cut on the fold and the caul cut on the bias and was narrowly gathered or pleated to fit the headpiece. Afterwards, the whole was narrowly hemmed around. Swaddling, which we are not technically discussing today, although we did discuss the concept earlier, because I do believe swaddling ought to be its own separate podcast. There are these little triangular bits of linen with ties called biggins that would go under the main cap instead of an undercap. The main cap itself was also made of fine linen, and many different styles appear in the late 18th century. It was common to have a bit of lace around the whole cap, but alternatively, one could do a little self-fabric ruffle instead. There are different styles and shapes that were appropriate, from the simple skull cap, similar in shape to the undercap, to a similar shape to the undercap, and other designs as well. These caps could be very highly decorated with embroidery or quilting, such as Marseille or Taprindo, or even made of silk and quilted in fancy designs. Some were done in metallic work. Again, they could be very, very fancy. Instructions for cutting out apparel for the poor has a single cap pattern, which they have labeled as figured 2 on the plate 6, but I believe that is a typo, and I think it should actually be figure 1, as figures 2 and 3 are for the undercap. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has a similar cap to what figure 1 would produce, but figure 2 could be used with a much different caul to create a new cap shape, sometimes seen with very detailed cord embroidery. Most caps do not appear to have ties but just lay on the head, but I have seen a few extant caps that did have short tape ties. Instructions for cutting out apparel for the poor recommends 6 caps be lent to the poor. 1781, an essay on the management of and nursing of children, says, quote, "The cap is simple and when put on has a neatness to it in it that surpasses all studied and expensive finery that has ever been devised for that purpose, and which purpose may be accounted for in conformity with the opinion that great many have, that a young child looks best in its nightcap, which this resembles," end quote. Instructions for cutting out apparel for the poor also mentions including 2 shifts, which I believe would be a type of stay or waistcoat that used over the bed to secure the underlayers. These were trimmed with lace, but I have found the directions to be quite confusing. I can't quite visualize it in my head, so I'm actually going to have to try to make this one out to see how it finishes. And that will give me more of an idea of how this garment would have been used. It does require tape and buttons and buttonholes, and is mentioned directly preceding the skirts or petticoats. And so I'm inclined to believe that this is actually a sort of stay, which one buttons the petticoats like you see in the early 19th century. But this is still a new time period for me, so I very well may be mistaken in that. Next, instructions for cutting out apparel for the poor mention sending 2 skirts made of linen diaper. These are called skirts, but they're really petticoats, complete with being pleated into the waistband and everything. It takes 12 yards of 18-inch diaper to make 2 petticoats, so these are quite wide skirts, and 5 breadths making up a skirt equals to about 2.5 yards wide today, so by a 43-inch long skirt, which of course would be hem. So we're talking about a 40-inch long skirt when it's all said and done, which by the way is what my skirts for the 18th century measure. We're putting that on an infant, which doesn't really actually surprise me because we have long skirts in the 19th century for infants as well, as long as they're not mobile. Once they're mobile, they become shortened, in which case we don't have the long skirts anymore. This is an era that 25 years ago we were swaddling infants like mummies, so in some areas still doing that, so I suppose 40-inch long skirts are less confining than that at least. And finally, we have frocks. Instructions for cutting out apparel for the poor suggest sending 2 of these. It mentioned frocks made of printed cotton, but I've seen some in linen and also in silk and wool. Some of these were decorated with embroidery as well. Instructions for cutting out apparel for the poor, of course, does have a simple frock pattern that I've not yet made up, but eventually will. Other items in that same work that is encouraged to be sent to the poor would be a set of linen sheets, 2 yards wide by 3¼ yards long, and 2 pillowcases made of Irish linen about 30 inches by 36 inches. For babies who are slightly older and begin to be mobile, pudding caps, or literally little cushioned headbands for them to wear to keep them from bumping their little heads, could be worn in addition to leading strings or strings put on dresses to keep track of a mobile infant as sort of a leash. For drooling infants, bibs may be made of white linen, and sometimes they are highly decorated, and they are generally quite long in order to cover most of the gown or frock. I have not found references to socks or stockings for infants yet, but since they were wrapped up in so much flannel, I doubt they were considered useful. And that will just about wrap up this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. Thank you so much for listening to my current research on dressing an 18th century baby. I've had a lot of fun researching for this, and I look forward to doing more. Next episode, we will go back to food preservation, where we talk about preserving fruits and vegetables in the mid-19th century. So be on the lookout for that episode in the coming weeks. If you have any questions or comments, you can find me on Instagram or YouTube under the name Caitlin Kearns. If you enjoyed this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers, please like it or leave a review or a comment, and share this episode with your friends. Also, please don't hesitate to tell me what topics you would like me to cover in future episodes. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next video.